I'd like to welcome everybody to our workshop today and our special lecture series presentation by Dr. Lauren Richmond. I'd like to welcome her back to our Wellness and Aging workshop. I think probably many of you have heard her talk to our workshop before, and actually she also had made a presentation, I think it was over in the Wang Center, to I think it was kind of a packed room, if I remember correctly, to OLLI a couple of years ago. So, but for those who are new and may not have heard Dr. Richmond before, Dr. Lauren Richmond is a professor at the Stony Brook Department of Psychology, and she's also a director of the Cognitive Aging and Memory Lab, also known as the CAM Lab. And I did want to, in addition to introducing her, just say a couple of words about the CAM Lab. The CAM Lab, is again doing some research on there are different research studies that are being done by the CAM Lab, and I volunteered to be on the list of, sometimes they need older adults to participate in some of these studies. And I've done a couple of them now, and I did one again just recently for it. I'd like to support the lab personally because I think that a lot of the work and research that they're doing hopefully will benefit all of us, as we age. And, they're trying to develop strategies and interventions for, improving our everyday memory. And so if you're interested in volunteering for one of the studies, I think what I should probably do is I have a link to the Cognitive Aging and Memory Lab that I can probably put in the chat box. And if you go on to the website, there is a link up there that you can use if you're interested in joining. As I mentioned, I did it just a couple of weeks ago, and fortunately now, as things are improving, and I know many of us have been vaccinated, myself included, they're actually able to do some of the research on campus again. I have to tell you, I felt very comfortable and very safe with how it was done. They actually have a VIP parking space right next to the psychology building for volunteers who are interested in participating. And one of the, I believe she's a graduate student, Julia, met me down there. We put a parking permit on the dashboard of my car, went inside, but everything was done very safely, I thought, and very professionally. So again, if you're interested in volunteering for any of the studies, I would encourage you to do that and help and support the research that they're doing. And I guess with that, then, I guess I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Richmond. Thank you so much for coming back and talking to us again today. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Lou. It's great to be here, and thank you for talking about the lab and what we're doing. We are open for business again, which we're really excited about. So if you are interested, please do sign up. We're looking for people to come in and do studies with us, some of which have been on hold since before the pandemic. And so we're really excited, and I'm really glad to hear that you felt that everything was safe and well thought out. We spent a lot of time planning how we would do this so that we could get back to bringing folks in, but make sure that everyone felt safe and comfortable. So I'm really glad to hear that worked out. Would you mind if I shared my screen? I have just a few slides that I thought I could show today. So as Lou said, I've spoken to OLLI a couple of times, and what I thought I would talk about today is a little bit of work that I started shortly before I had come to Stony Brook and plan to continue looking at how people remember where stuff is in the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about memory for spatial locations, ability to navigate through space, age differences in that ability, and sort of variability across individuals, and then talk a little bit about some brain imaging data that I've collected on this question in a sample of healthy older adults. So let me just get this going here.
Yeah, you're a host, so you can go ahead and share.
Thank you. Okay, let me do this. Okay, you can all see my slides now?
Yes.
Thank you. So I titled this talk, How Do I Get There From Here? Spatial Navigation Skills Across the Lifespan. And as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we might care about where stuff is in the world, why it might matter, a little bit about what we know about age differences and gender differences in spatial navigation and spatial memory, and then talk about some neuroimaging data. So kind of as a place to start and maybe to orient us to why I might be thinking about spatial navigation and spatial memory, given what you've heard me talk about before, which are things like memory training interventions, strategies to improve memory. Why spatial memory? Why spatial navigation? Kind of my whole thing is about understanding when people come into the lab, what they look like when they're outside of the lab. We know that we bring people into the lab, we set up these artificial conditions, which are really important to do. We can control for lots of extraneous variables. We can manipulate things in ways that aren't necessarily available to us in sort of naturalistic settings. But it's also really important to me in the work that I do that what I capture in the lab translates to what people look like when they're outside of the lab. And that's not always true. There are some memory paradigms where when people come into the lab, they might look like they're doing really poorly. In particular, the ability to remember to do stuff in the future is a place where we see this, this naturalistic paradox. People come into the lab, they're put under these conditions, and older adults in general tend to do poorly on these lab-based tasks of remembering to perform intentions later. But then when you do naturalistic studies, we see a lot more equivalence across lifespan in terms of the ability to carry out future intentions. And so there's at least one example of a place where we know that people look different in the real world than they do when they're in the lab. And so it's important to me kind of in the wild to understand how people look by bringing them into the lab, being able to do some of this control that I've talked about that's really important, but being able to really capture that ability. So that's kind of where most of my interests start. And in that vein, I'm really interested in thinking about spatial memory and spatial navigation skills in aging. So on average, we know that older adults have more difficulty navigating both familiar and new spaces compared to younger adults. And that older adults exhibit more difficulty remembering the location of landmarks. We also know that this is a really important skill in everyday life, right? Being able to figure out which floor your room is on in an apartment building or in a hotel. If you visited a hotel recently, or maybe not so recently, if you're visiting a hotel, you might need to, all of the rooms sort of look the same. You might need to remember when I get off the elevator, I go left to get to my room rather than having to locate that placard that tells you which way to go. You might be able to sort of remember that after you've been able to enact that a few times. Similarly, navigating around your own hometown. You might need to make a stop at the bank on your way home from the grocery store, and that might not be your normal routine. Your normal routine might not involve that stop at the bank. So you have to think about what's the most efficient way to navigate there rather than having to drive all the way back home and then restart your route if that's the way that you tend to go. So you might have to plan these sort of novel routes, work around a detour kind of in the moment. And if we have these well elaborated cognitive maps, we know where stuff is in the environment, we can sort of figure out how to most efficiently get from A to B. And those are really important skills that we know can be compromised in old age, but are really important for maintenance of kind of independent living, which is a really important thing in the context of late life. And so what we wanted to do was try to understand both what kinds of tasks might give rise to these age differences that have been observed in the previous literature. There might be some tasks for which older and younger adults show more equivalence to one another than for other kinds of tasks. So the way that you test spatial memory might matter for the kinds of patterns that you observe. Maybe not so surprising, but a really important question that hasn't been addressed often. Typically, you see people giving one or another type of test, but not testing multiple ways of assessing spatial memory within a single task. And we also wanted to know when there's a spatial memory challenge, how do younger and older adults solve that challenge? And are the bases for the solution different? Do older adults rely on different kinds of cognitive faculties, bring to bear different kinds of abilities than do younger adults in order to solve a spatial memory challenge? So let me just show you how we did this in a behavioral study that I'm going to tell you about some data for. we had younger and older adults come into the lab, and we had them encode videos of a camera person navigating an environment. And as the camera person navigated the environment, what they would do was call out landmarks along the route, and participants knew that they were going to be asked to remember the location of those landmarks later. So let me just give you a flavor for what this looked like. Just let you see a quick snippet. Oh, you may not be able to hear my sound, but luckily we have a label on the screen as well.
Umbrella. Paper rack.
So these objects that are named and labeled were the things that participants were asked to remember for later. And then we tested participants' memory in a number of different ways for where these things were. I'm going to take you through each of the tasks. So first we had folks do what we called a virtual appointing task, where what they did again was watch the camera person navigate an environment. And then the camera person would turn to this center hallway, to this purple hall, the purple wall. And then an object would appear at the top of the screen along with that label that was shown. And then the participant would orient the camera in the direction that they would look if there were no walls blocking their view. So you weren't able to actually see these things, you couldn't locate them in space, but we wanted you to sort of look how you would look to see that object. So again, let's just take a quick look at how that played out. It's easier to actually see it than to imagine it. It's a little bit laggy, probably because I have Zoom going. Oh no. Okay, so here he is orienting to that center hallway. Sorry, it's lagging. So you can see now that there's an object named at the top and the camera is being oriented, and then the participant would press enter when they think they're looking in the direction that the object was located. So that's what the pointing task looked like. Then we had folks estimate the distances between pairs of landmarks. So we said things like Blue Bend, Labstool, how far apart were these things? And then we had participants draw a map. And in the map, they were asked to indicate the start location, the direction of travel, and where each of the landmarks were around the route. And so we can then look at spatial memory from three different tasks: the pointing task, the distance estimation task, and this map drawing task, to try to get a sense for, are the age differences that have been observed in previous literature universal across all three tasks, or does the task matter in terms of whether or not you're going to see differences between younger and older adults? So again, just to kind of take us through, you watched the camera person walk the route, called out some landmarks for you to remember, then participants did the pointing task, then they estimated distances, then they drew a map, and then there was another follow-up phase that I'm not going to talk about today. And we had three different routes for which this occurred. Questions before I move on from this procedure? Open up the chat and see if anybody's.
I don't see anything.
Oh, I see Karen's raising her hand. And I think Susan also raised her hand. Go ahead, Karen, first.
Yes, I just had a question. The fact that this is all done via computer, in other words, watching the camera navigate the halls, isn't the use of the computer kind of a intervening factor, making it a little more difficult?
Yeah,
I mean, go ahead.
Go ahead. That's a really interesting question. There are data to suggest that the differences that some of these differences that have been observed across younger and older adult samples are similar in magnitude, depending on whether you do it on the computer versus in real life. However, the kinds of errors that people might make can be larger in the context of computerized tasks like this. We thought about doing this in real life. I think there's a couple of really important things that made us decide that we should do it on the computer. The probably the most important was that all of these environments were unfamiliar to our participants. So these participants were recruited from St. Louis, the St. Louis, Missouri and the surrounding community. That's where I did my postdoc. And we had these videos taken from a university campus in South Carolina. So we wanted all of our participants to be equally unfamiliar, both younger adults and older adults, to try to understand how do people build up these representations for where stuff is in an environment, kind of in early learning. There have been studies looking at how people remember information over the long term. So things like how do you figure out the most efficient route to stop at the bank on the way home from the grocery store. And we know that experience with the environment certainly helps. So older adults can do better than younger adults given the longevity of their experience, but also tend to navigate less flexibly. And so when there's a detour on the planned route, older adults tend to be more thrown off their game than younger adults who might have another third route in mind that they can then follow. So there's some interesting differences there about how long you've known about the environment or how much familiarity you have that we wanted to kind of eliminate in this context. So that was one, that was our decision, but there are data sort of mapping these things, at least in terms of the conclusions one might make about age differences or not, being similar in magnitude across computerized and actual experiences.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Great question. Susan, I think you had a question, and I think somebody else raised their hand, and I'm sorry I missed the name. So let's go to Susan, and then let's see who else. Go ahead.
Susan, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. I have always had a very strange, learning disability, which is I am not able to reverse where I'm going. Like if I'm going along a certain route, I have to consciously say to myself, I turned right before, and now if I'm going back the way I came, I have to turn left. I've always had this from the time of my youngest age. So needless to say, if I don't use this kind of a memory trick of consciously talking about where I went before and then reversing it, I get lost a lot. This is a math related skill, really. I also, and it's not a surprise, I'm very bad at math because spatial things like this, figuring out how far things are apart, is math based. So my question is, wouldn't you want to, before you do this comparison of young versus old, screen out people like me who've always had problems like this? Otherwise, you're not measuring what you want to measure, and it'll skewer your results. So
Good question.
You need some sort of screening, whether it's to find out how good people are at math, since this is a math related skill, or, ask people if, have you always had problems navigating?
Great question. So we did ask people on post-test if this is something that they thought had changed over time or not. In our younger adults, it's kind of hard to ask that question because they should say, yeah, it's gotten better because I know more stuff and I have more of a sense of how things go. And so they've learned a lot over their early developmental periods that should make spatial navigation easier. This is maybe a more telling question in our older adults, but we actually know there's a lot of inter-individual variability in general in spatial navigation. So I sort of gave you this sort of nice summary at the beginning, like older adults on average are worse than younger adults, but it's also true that, and you'll see in some of the plots I'm going to show you, that some of our older adults outperform a subsample of our younger adults. And so we thought about whether we wanted to screen for them or not, but we actually wanted to capture a little bit of the inter-individual variability. So we ended up with 38 younger and 38 older adults. And so we have a little bit of a chance to try to understand both the spread of abilities that folks display and these age differences.
I know that you're not measuring for this, but my thought is that ability in math is a very telling variable that would affect how good people are at these tasks.
Yeah, I mean, So I'll tell you a little bit about what we did measure for. We did not test for math. That's kind of an interesting idea for follow-up studies. Teresa.
Yeah, a lot of people, I mean, I'm in particular, we learn certain ways. Some people learn by their ears. Another person has to have a drawing to see it. I've always been a map person. You could describe anything to me, and I'd rather see it on paper.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's taken into consideration in these tests.
It's not. And we wanted to kind of mimic how you might learn about the world if you were traveling around it in the first place. So we do ask people to draw those maps for us, but we don't give them a map to look at. There have been studies looking at if people are better at remembering or are better at learning from maps versus first person experience. Again, we made and what you see in general is that you can see better evidence across some of these interlandmark locations if you can sort of get a sense for everything all at once in a single shot. Again, our interest was in sort of like, what do you do in the real world? And what you tend to do in the real world is like navigate around it and figure out where stuff is. We might look at a map before going to a new place, but that's not, I think that's a less representative experience than maybe this one that we've tried to mimic here in the lab. That's a great question. Roberta, I see your hand and then I'm going to go on.
Yeah, and I'm going to be redundant because I was going to say I have always been navigationally challenged, always. And again, too, I am not a math person, but I mean, for as long as I can remember, I could be walking in the mall and I walk into a store. When I walk out, I will always turn the opposite way. And my friends know this. So, and again, too, if somebody gives me directions and I draw those pictures, in other words, you go to the stop sign, you make a left, then I'm fine. But I think there are a lot of people like Susan and who was this other woman, the one before, that really who just don't have the ability, you know, to navigate that way. I would always drive and somebody in the car would always navigate. So, you know, that's, once I've gone someplace, then I will remember. But, you know, if it's, you know, the first time, yeah, I'm not too great. And I think there are a lot of us. And it's interesting that I'm listening to everybody who came before me and I'm just saying exactly what they've said. So that's 3 of us in a row. So, so maybe it might be a good idea to include some of those specific questions,
yeah,
you know, in your study.
Yep. Again, we didn't do that here, but there are data to suggest that people, again, there's lots of inter-individual variability. Folks are good or not so good at this task. That's true across the lifespan. So again, on average, old are worse than young, but you'll certainly see that there's a lot of variability in both age groups. We actually know that men tend to be better navigators than women, although we didn't actually see that in our data. So I'll just spoil that for you. We looked at that. We balanced for males versus females and didn't see any evidence of that appearing in at least our task. But in general, those gender differences have been found. And we know that people can report pretty well on their sense of direction. So there's a lab out at Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, that looks at how people sort of think about their navigational skill. And if people tell you they're bad navigators, it turns out they pretty much are. And if they tell you they're good, they're pretty good. So we have actually a really good sense for how good or not so good we are at these things, which is actually somewhat dissimilar from other kinds of tasks that we enact in the lab or that we test in the lab. Sometimes people think they're really good at stuff and it turns out they're not so good at it. But this is a place where when people tell you that they're good or not so good, you take them at their word because the data seem to suggest that they know what they're talking about. John, go ahead.
Just a comment on the men versus women on directions. Men tend to be, this psychological thing, they're linear thinkers mostly. So that's why I think they're better at navigating because they go point A, point B, point C. Women tend to be more diverse in their thinking. So they may go to point A, then C, you know, I think it's just the way men and women think slightly differently.
I think there's certainly that. And then there's some data that are coming out now in younger children suggesting that it's about STEM education and the fact that women traditionally were not encouraged into STEM fields, science, technology, education, math, the way that men were. And so there's some evidence to suggest that some of these gender differences might be about the kinds of educational experiences that we have early in life that might be gendered. Okay, so here's what we did. Now watch a video, figure out where stuff is, or the camera person tells you where stuff is, then you point to it, then you estimate distances, then you draw a map. Then we had people come back another day because we weren't done torturing them enough. And we had them do a couple of different tasks to try to index other facets of cognition. So we wanted to test people's working memory skills. Is working memory important for your ability to remember where stuff is in the environment? We tested verbal memory. We think about spatial and verbal as being kind of two sides of the same coin. So we wanted to test whether people's verbal memory skills might be related to performance in this task. And we also tested processing speed. We know in general, as we get older, our processing speed slows, and maybe it's just harder to integrate information quickly as you're experiencing the environment. So maybe processing speed is going to be really important for being able to remember where these things are in the environment. So let me just show you what we found in terms of straight up age differences first, and then I'll tell you how they are maybe related to some of these other tasks that we tapped into, these other cognitive domains, working memory, verbal memory, and processing speed. Okay. In our hands, what we saw is that older adults were less accurate on the pointing task compared to younger adults. So our older adults are here in salmon, our younger adults are here in this aqua color. This is an error score, so higher is worse. On average, older adults worse than younger adults. So this is a task where we see that kind of classic age difference that's been reported in the literature. When it comes to estimating distances, this again is an error score, so higher is worse. And what you see is that we don't see any evidence of age differences. So older adults and younger adults were performed similarly on this task. And you'll also note that everyone did really poorly at this. So this might be one of those places where actually having the navigational experience could help, although we know people are actually pretty bad at estimating distances in general. We tried to look at this a few different ways. I'm just showing you here estimates for feet. We tried to do some sort of scaling, like where things that were estimated to be further apart, did they give higher numbers for things that were closer together? It didn't really matter. So the feet distance estimation error is probably the most straightforward to think about. But if you try to think about scaling and stuff, it didn't really seem to make a difference in terms of whether or not we saw evidence in support of the idea that there might be an age difference. We don't see that here. So just to kind of spoil it, I'm not going to talk about this task later because since we're not seeing differences, trying to understand how the ability to perform these tests might rely on different kinds of cognitive domains for younger and older adults doesn't make a ton of sense. And we see, again, evidence for an age difference. We're here now, we're looking at accuracy. So lower is worse, and older adults were on average producing less accurate maps than our younger adults. So 2 out of our 3 tasks showed the expected age difference, and 1 of those tasks didn't. So again, it depends on the kinds of tasks that you're asking people to do, whether or not you actually see evidence for that age difference that's been reported in the literature. The more interesting and novel question is whether or not older and younger adults rely on different kinds of cognitive faculties to perform these tasks. And so what we wanted to know was whether these different kinds of cognitive processes or these abilities in these other domains might come into play more or less for younger and older adults to solve these spatial memory challenges. So for our pointing task, what we see is actually really interesting. So again, our older adults here in the salmon color and our younger adults here in the aqua color. And what you see is that older adults who are performing better on each of the indexes of processing speed, verbal memory, and working memory are showing lower evidence for, are showing lower pointing errors. So it matters if you're an older adult, if you have better processing speed, better verbal memory and working memory, you're going to be better able to solve that spatial memory challenge. So older adults might be doing things like the older adults who are performing well in this task might be integrating information more quickly over time, might be using some sort of verbal labeling system that might help them understand how things are related to one another, and might be able to sort of in the moment solve that problem, tax their working memory skills to try to solve this pointing task. When it comes to the map task, though, we actually see a very different pattern. Here, we don't see any evidence for there being an age difference in terms of how the performance on each of these domains is related to performance on the map task. So doing better in each of the domains, processing speed, verbal memory, working memory, is related to having better performance on the map task, but we don't see any additive benefit or that there's any difference in the ability to bring these cognitive faculties to bear for younger adults compared to older adults. So let me just kind of summarize what I've told you so far, and then I'll jump into some of our neuroimaging data. In 2 of our 3 spatial memory tasks, older adults were shown to perform worse than younger adults. And so again, it matters whether the task that you choose for testing whether or not there are age differences in performance depends quite a bit on the task. If I had only done the distance estimation task, I would have made the conclusion that there's no difference in our hands, but 2 of our other tasks did show an age difference. And again, I want to point out that there's a lot of variability in performance within each age group. Looking just at these, at the scatter plots, you can see that there are quite a few salmon dots over here where we see lots of these blue dots. And so yeah, on average, it looks like younger adults are outperforming older adults. That's what we saw on the bar charts that I showed you before. But there's a lot of variability in both groups. And so again, there's sort of that group difference, but there's also the inter-individual variability. It's really important to think about here. And our data suggests that spatial memory tasks relate to cognitive performance in these other domains, processing speed, verbal memory, and working memory, in different ways for older and younger adults. In particular, for older adults, there might be some sort of secondary strategy going on with respect to that pointing task, using some of those verbal labels or something else that younger adults don't seem to be doing as much or doesn't seem to be as impactful for them. Okay. So now I want to just take us to thinking about where, kind of what's going on in the brain of an older adult who's able to solve a spatial memory challenge well. And so we wanted to know what older adult brains looked like when they were encoding a new environment. So having that experience of the camera person navigating an environment. And then what do the brains what's the pattern of activity exhibited at retrieval? So we collected data from 20 healthy older adults, and we had participants were pre-exposed to the pointing task, which is the task that they did when they were in the scanner. And they also saw a little bit of the route that they saw the routes that they were going to experience in the scanner. We didn't have them draw the maps. We didn't have them do a cognitive battery. We didn't have them estimate distances. So all we did was had folks come in, view the routes in the scanner, and perform the pointing task in the scanner. And once they were in the scanner, they watched each route once more and then pointed directly after. And what we wanted to look at was how performance patterns of activation looked when they were encoding the routes initially and when they were performing the pointing task. And we also looked at the relationship between hippocampal volume and retrieval accuracy. The hippocampus is a part of the brain that we know is really important for supporting long-term memory and has been implicated in spatial memory. And so we wanted to know, you may have heard about some of the Eleanor McGuire's work on London taxi drivers and the relationship between London taxi drivers who had these really well elaborated maps of the London streets and having these larger hippocampi. So we wanted to see in our sample of healthy older adults, do we see evidence for the idea that folks who have larger hippocampi also exhibit more accurate retrieval? All right, so first to encoding. People are watching that camera person navigate the route. The camera person's calling out landmarks along the route. And we wanted to sort of know what state is the brain and what do we see when folks are engaged in this route encoding experience. So what we see is actually high levels of activation of regions that have been classically associated with spatial memory. So we see some of these superior and medial temporal lobe structures, and the hippocampus is kind of right in this sweet spot, kind of inside the cortex. So we'll talk a little bit about the hippocampus later. We see parietal deactivation, which parietal lobe has been associated with spatial memory. And we see activation in some of these frontal regions. And we know that frontal regions are really important for exerting control and directing attention. And so this makes a lot of sense what we're seeing here in terms of activations. These hot colors, these orange and Yellow colors show levels where we're seeing higher levels of activity, and these blue cooler tones are showing where we see levels of lower activity. So first of all, yeah, looks like things are going well. Everyone's kind of encoding information and sort of, as they're encoding information, they're exhibiting activity in canonical memory regions, spatial memory regions. That looks good. What's happening at retrieval? We see actually some similarities to our previous image and some differences. First of all, I think the kind of one thing you can see is that there's just a lot more going on at retrieval. Makes sense. You're not just passively watching. Now you're engaged in a task. You're thinking about where things are. You're trying to figure out, here's where I am. Here's where the object is. I'm pointing to it. Again, orange and yellow are the hot colors, areas of higher levels of activity. And the blue colors are areas that are exhibiting lower levels of activity. And again, we see some of these canonical spatial memory regions. In particular, we see lots of activity now in those parietal regions that before we were seeing lower levels of activity. And so there might be something interesting there about the balance of deactivation at retrieval and activation during, deactivation during encoding and activation at retrieval that might be interesting. We also see quite a bit of activity in frontal and medial parietal regions. Again, regions that have been classically associated with spatial memory. So it looks like the brain is kind of in these two different states when you're encoding and when you're retrieving spatial memory. And we think that this might suggest the interplay or the balance between those two, that activations at encoding and deactivations at retrieval or vice versa might be really important for supporting spatial memory. Just to test the question about the hippocampus and whether that's related to spatial memory, we're seeing a negative relationship, higher error, so pointing error again, higher is worse, and hippocampal volume where lower is smaller. And so yeah, it's in the right direction, but we don't see a significant effect here. We have a small sample size, so take that with a grain of salt, but at least in our hands, we're not seeing strong evidence to support that relationship between volume of the hippocampus and performance on our pointing task. Okay, so what the heck does this all mean? I've told you a lot of stuff. I've talked you through a lot of data. Who cares? I would just sort of say that examining older adult performance in tasks that more closely map onto real world challenges that older adults might actually face can make our findings more directly applicable to everyday life. I would also say that there's some good news here where we know that there are at least some tests where older adults can perform just as well as younger adults. So it depends how you test older adults' memory for spatial information, how they're going to look. And I think that it's really important to think a little bit about that we're kind of getting at this question from multiple angles. We're not just relying on one specific type of test to try to understand how older and younger adults may or may not differ on their spatial navigation and spatial memory skills. And the patterns that we observe here, I think, could be really informative in thinking about strategies for improving performance, particularly for older adults who are exhibiting difficulty in the spatial navigation and spatial memory domain. So thinking about, taking that distance information and trying to translate that to then map drawing. If we know that these things were further apart, they should be farther apart on the map, and trying to think about interventions that might tap into the skills that older adults seem to be showing well enough to try to inform interventions in some of these domains where there might be a little bit more difficulty for older folks. With that, I would like to say thank you to all of you for your attention, to my collaborators, and to the NIH for supporting this work. And I also, again, want to kind of start where Lou started by reminding you that we are recruiting for studies in our lab. And if you're interested in learning more, you can sign up to be contacted about our research, visit our website, or follow us on Facebook. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you all so much.
Oh, Lauren, there is a question in the chat. Did handedness play a role in performance?
Great question. In our behavioral study, I don't think we looked at handedness. We looked at gender. I don't think we looked at handedness. In the imaging study, we actually restricted to right-handed individuals. It turns out that left-handers, myself included, have crazy brains where sometimes at a higher rate for left-handers compared to right-handers, the things that we think of being localized to the left and right hemisphere sometimes switch. So we think about language being preferentially activating the left hemisphere, and that's true enough, and it's more true for right-handers than left-handers. A higher percentage of left-hand or right-handers show that pattern compared to left-handers. I think it's about 30% of left-handers show lateralization for language on the right-hand side. And so in imaging studies, it's pretty common to restrict to right-handed individuals, particularly if you want to do fMRI studies, just because it adds a little bit of variance that might be hard to interpret. Great question. Lou.
Yes, thank you very much. I had a question with regards to the variability that you mentioned in some of the research that you were doing. And I was wondering if possibly some of the variability might just be due to things like, we've heard that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And it could be that, some of the variability may be due to the fact that, some people have, do better on some, not just in, on these studies, but in general, better memory performance based on whether it's nutrition or how much they, exercise the brain, or lifelong learners, things like that, I guess.
I think that's, sorry, Lou, was there more?
No, that's it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So this is a really interesting question. Again, I'll just kind of go back here. So we see what looks like, particularly for this map drawing, a linear relationship, right? People who are doing better, I should have mentioned before and I didn't, these are Z-scores. So higher is better for processing speed, verbal memory, and working memory. And so folks who are exhibiting better performance on each of these domains are also showing better performance on the map drawing task. So we see that linear relationship. But we also see lots of variability where we see some of these salmon dots kind of creeping into the aqua dots. So there's some older adults who are outperforming a pretty large swath of the younger adults, right? It's a really interesting question, kind of what differentiates this subsample of older adults from the other older adults who are performing less well. But I think at least these data suggest that, that to the extent to which you're kind of having preservation of function in general, you might be better positioned to do well on at least this test of spatial memory, and maybe also might be better positioned to take advantage of some of the additional strategies that you might be able to bring to bear in the context of pointing to these unseen landmarks, kind of locating things from a location where you have to sort of imagine how you would get from here to there, or what the most efficient route would be.
Thank you.
Kenneth.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
I find your study very interesting, fascinating, and well done, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Like the people at the beginning, I have a confession I'll talk about myself. I think I probably speak for a lot of us, not so much about my aging abilities in spatial stuff, which I know has gotten worse. I believe it's gotten worse. And I predicted if I took your test, I'd be at the bottom few percentile. However, it has always been a problem for me. I mean, I was academically successful. I thought I was a poser. I was really stupid because I have really bad with directions. My wife, who's sitting next to me, is a cognitive psychologist trained in your department, and she told me, "Hey, there are a lot of different types of intelligence, so I don't feel so stupid anymore." I'm exaggerating to make a point. Can you tell me how this handicap that I have relates to the rest of, not me, but in general? What does it mean about the rest of my intellectual functioning? That's a
Not much. Turns out.
So am I stupid or not? That's the question.
No.
I'm kidding.
Well, we think that this is a really important skill that, I think that gets taxed an awful lot in everyday life, but it really doesn't mean anything. So in some of that work that I talked about earlier from the Santa Barbara group, they asked people, how are you at navigating? And the people that say they're lousy turn out to be lousy, but then they test them on other stuff and they do fine.
I get lost all the time without her.
So it really doesn't seem to map directly onto these other domains. I'm suggesting, here, yeah, maybe if you're doing better in these other domains, you can sort of do something like give yourself a verbal label like far, close, and then maybe that'll help you on that distance task where you're saying, oh yeah, those two things were far and those two things were closer together. But it turns out that we don't see really any evidence to suggest that like people who have a poor sense of direction exhibit lower IQs or exhibit lower performance on average in other cognitive domains. So we think it's a really important domain, but we don't think it kind of tells us much about anything else that a person can do. And I think these days, luckily, to the chagrin of some people who study spatial memory, we can certainly get around the world pretty efficiently, even without relying on our own spatial memory. We have Google Maps, we have GPS, we have lots of these other kinds of assistive technologies.
Lifesaver for me.
Some folks really think that this is a problem because you don't have to rely on your own ability to navigate an environment, but if that's not something you've ever been good at, why bother? Why spend 20 minutes getting lost? As far as I'm concerned, go ahead and use your GPS and maybe reserve your cognitive efforts for something that you'll find more enjoyable and maybe be able to be successful at.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I appreciate the very reassured. I'm reassured once again. Thank you.
Susan, I see you. I'm going to answer Debbie's question in the.
Sure. No,
sorry, I'm going to answer Linda's question in the chat. Then I'll get to you. Then I'll answer Debbie.
Okay.
Linda, how much does innate spatial awareness affect this study?
Yeah. I just wanted to tell you that I saw 60 Minutes yesterday. And for those of you that follow gymnastics, they know who Simone Biles is, who's probably the greatest gymnast in existence at this time. And they were talking about spatial awareness and the fact that she has innate spatial awareness, and that's enabled her to do all the tricks that she does.
Yep.
Because she knows where her body is in space at all times.
Yep.
Now, how much would that impact, like you're born with a certain amount of spatial awareness or a certain degree of spatial awareness? And how would that impact?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So I think there's two pieces to your question. One is about the sort of innate nature of spatial awareness. I think I have a different interest in whether or not that can be trained, and if there are folks who have a lot of difficulty, if there's any amount of training that could be helpful, or if there's sort of an upper limit for how good you can get, if that's something you don't come out with at the beginning. I think those are lots of really interesting questions that we don't know the answer to. We do know that spatial memory challenges, so I didn't get into this here, but we know that reference frames are really important. So you can navigate kind of or you can learn about information two ways. Somebody did ask the questions kind of related to this earlier. You can have that first person navigational experience that's probably more like what we tend to do in everyday life. So that's what we did here. But then you can also learn information from a map. You might look at a map and figure out, okay, here's where these things are are further apart. I have to make a left-hand turn around this corner to get to the other stuff that I'm going to be looking at. And that's a different kind of reference frame. So there's one reference frame that's sort of body centered. Where am I in relation to these other things in the environment? The pointing task in particular really taps into that. I'm standing here. That means that that thing is over there versus over there. And it kind of depends where you're standing, whether it's over there or over there.
Right.
And the map drawing task is sort of that, it's really decentered from the body. You don't have to place yourself in this environment. You just know where all the stuff is. And so this is kind of called a cognitive map. We have this cognitive map in our minds where all the stuff is, and you can say, oh yeah, I'd be standing here, I'd be standing here, but you don't have to have kind of your own sense of where you are. And there are some data to suggest that older adults tend to do better on the body-centered task than they do from these sort of depersonalized tests or these sort of cognitive mapping kinds of tests. The pointing task I said to you kind of matters where you are, but you do also have to sort of toggle between those two frames of reference. And that might be why that task showed that sort of unique pattern with respect to the other variables. You have to know where you are, but you also have to know where all the stuff is. So you have to have kind of a cognitive map, and then you have to figure out where you are in that map to be able to figure out if I'm standing here, the podium's this direction, or if I'm standing here, the podium's really a lot less of an angle from me if I'm standing right here than if I'm all the way over here. So we think that that might be part of the reason why that pointing task showed that really unique pattern. But I think that's a really interesting question.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Susan, go ahead.
Let me just, one of the things that I find is a problem for me is sometimes I'm slow at retrieval. I know certain things, but to retrieve them on a dime's notice, it takes me a little bit to, I know a certain article that I read, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author, and I know it, but maybe an hour later it comes into my head, oh yes, it's thus and such.
Yeah.
So I know retrieval is an issue. One of the pieces of practical application of your study that I'm very interested in is mnemonics, because I did my own master's study on teaching a developmentally delayed young lady how to take word problem tests in math tests, which she had to take. And I obviously, she didn't have the ability to think from a math point of view. So I invented mnemonics to help her, like walk, don't crawl, add, in all. So I bonded adding and the words in all. So she saw in all in a problem, she knew she should add. That was what I did. And I'm thinking in terms of older adults who are very, who have a lot of trouble with their spatial, finding their way and so on their way to the bank or the grocery store, that mnemonics might be a way to get people to remember where they're going. And that's just a suggestion in terms of practical application of how to help this situation. Because, I see a comparison between somebody who might be a little bit developmentally delayed, and when somebody gets quite on and they're losing a lot of their abilities, but they're still at home and so on. And I think mnemonics would help.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. So we thought about this from a little bit of a different perspective. Just thinking about how folks might use navigationally relevant landmarks. So if you know that when we have to think about what's salient in the environment. If there's like a house that's painted lavender, right? That would be something that's strange. It's grab your attention. And if you know that when you get to the lavender house, you always want to turn left to get to the town center or to your favorite grocery store or whatever, you can kind of count on that to be there, except for when the house gets painted. So if they decide to make it just a boring gray or a beige, then you're kind of in a really tough spot. So we tried to think a little bit about how you might be able to develop strategies that rely on landmarks that are less likely to be changed. So maybe things like street signs, maybe things like, like signs announcing that you're at a specific part of town, probably more unlikely to be changed than maybe somebody's house color whims. And so we tried to think about, well, what kinds of landmarks could you think about using? And could you think about using those landmarks flexibly? So when I get to the town center sign, if I want to go to the bank, I go left. But when I get to the town center sign, if I want to go to the grocery store, I would make a right. So whether you could kind of use those to serve as like an if then. If I'm at the town center and I want to go to the bank, go, what did I say, right? I don't even remember. If I wanted to go to the store, go left. I saw another question in the chat. So Debbie, are there any longitudinal studies on this? There are some longitudinal data on this, starting usually from midlife, looking at how people change or don't change over time. What we know is that folks who are doing well to start with tend to continue to do well into late life. So that's a little bit of that variability that we saw. If you're good at it, you're going to stay good at it, even though you might get a little bit worse as you get older. You're probably still going to be on the higher end of your age group. If we see big changes that don't look linear, that tends to be indicative of some bigger problem, some sort of cognitive disruption, dementia, stroke, something that might be a little bit more of a bigger issue. And so really big shifts kind of, especially in a short period of time, tend to be more indicative of something maybe pathological, or at least something that should be checked out. Kenneth, I see your hand. Oh, Kenneth, you're muted.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm gonna stick back this question. I'm thinking about people who have dementia and get totally lost. Not it can be a tragic type happening.
Yeah.
Or get lost. What's my question? I presume that they would be in the worst end of the spectrum of what you are studying. Is that about right?
Yeah, so in this study, we only enrolled healthy older adults, and we had them not only do all of these things, but we had them pass a couple of cognitive screening measures. And so folks that we reported in this study had already screened in as far as being normal on these brief cognitive screeners. We certainly do know that spatial awareness, spatial navigation can be a problem, or memory for where you might be going. Wandering is something that we see in folks with dementia. So we wanted to kind of know what the range of normal was as far as before we get into pathology. That's a really interesting and important question. And again, I think really those sharp shifts of like, I was always good at navigating and now I really am having a problem. That's where we start to think about there being maybe something of that one might want to discuss with their doctor.
Getting back to me, I'm only a little worse, so that's not so bad. Is that right?
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I don't see any more in the chat.
I had a question.
Okay, good.
Go ahead. Pat, go ahead.
Pat, go
Oh,
ahead.
hi. Yes. Recently, I watched a show on human senses. It was about the human body. And it showed a young couple who were skating partners. And they did very, very difficult maneuvers. And during it, he would put her over his head. And she said frequently she had her eyes closed during that her senses, she knew where she was spatially with her eyes closed, more so than having her eyes open. I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. We know that you can get vestibular feedback through a real navigational experience. This is another way that our camera experience is different, very different than maybe what you would have in the real world, that you can sort of figure out how much slope there is in the landmark or how far you travel because your vestibular system's kind of capturing that. And maybe folks who have these really well-developed skills tend to be better at kind of understanding that sense and using less of their sort of visual senses to figure out where they are in space. Chrissy, does the distance between objects worsen as we age? You discussed this, but I'm wondering if it can become a problem while driving in a moderate way. Do you mean the ability to estimate distances between objects?
Chrissy, are you on? Let's see if she's still on. Yeah, she's still here. Chrissy, can you elaborate?
Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was still on mute. Yes, I didn't write that correctly. I was in a rush. I noticed a couple of my friends, as they're driving, can't seem to judge the distance between cars. They keep telling me it's because they're getting older. Or they use that a car where it tells you when you're going over the line. Is that a symptom of aging, or is that something that can become a real issue?
So,
wondering because you did the distance between.
Yeah.
That's long distances, correct? Not short distances.
Yeah, these were not short distances. So these were things that were feet apart. I think the closest thing was maybe like 12 or 15 feet apart.
Right.
So I think that in general, the answer to your question is it depends what the basis for that changes. We know that visual perception can change as a function of age, and the ability to perceive distances might be one of those things that might change. And so if it's on that basis, it would be a visual problem. I would think about that less as a as a common cognitive issue in old age, but I think that in shorter, our data don't really speak to this because the distances were long enough.
Yes, I thought possibly, yes, that might be it, because you look like, even with the map, the distances were far apart.
I think the closest thing might have been about 15 or so feet, 15 or
that's
20
totally
feet.
different, Jen. Yes.
Yeah.
I found this very interesting. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you. I see one more hand. Go ahead.
Is that me? Because my name isn't attached to it.
Yep,
I,
exactly right.
I wondered how much you took into account. And you mentioned this answering the last question, but changes in perception, hearing, vision, and vision in particular. At one point, I thought I had a good spatial sense. And as my vision has decreased to almost nothing, I find that I really don't have a good spatial sense.
Yeah, great question. So we didn't test people for vision, but we screened people for visual acuity. So we asked if they had normal or corrected to normal vision and normal or corrected to normal hearing. We didn't further test folks that said, yeah, I have normal or corrected to normal vision. So we don't have sort of an overt measure of here's what their vision 2020, not 2020. But at least everyone that was included in our study self-reported that they had normal vision or that they had corrective lenses or something they could wear to the lab. On an anecdotal level, which take that with a grain of salt, I don't recall anyone struggling to the point where I felt like they couldn't see the images. They knew what they had seen. They knew what the landmarks were. They certainly might have had trouble figuring out where they were in space, but no one like couldn't figure out which one was the basket and which one was the paper rack or anything along those lines. So nobody kind of gave me pause in terms of like, do you actually know which are the objects that we're asking? Like, could you see the object in the environment?
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think I got to everybody.
I think so. I don't see anything else in here. Yeah, I think that's all for the questions.
Thank you all so much. This was really fun. I'm glad we were able to connect even though it's over Zoom, and I hope that we can connect again in person soon.
Thank you.